There are words that do not remain politely in their dictionaries, and vagabond is one of those most incorrigible among them. It refuses to sit still. It refuses to behave. It drifts from century to century, as though grammar were merely a suggestion, and history a long, open road with no clear ending. If one were to catch the word and ask it where it is going, it would likely answer with a shrug and continue walking. Its earliest known form belongs to the Romans, who had a habit of naming things with a kind of practical bluntness that later ages would soften into poetry. They used vagus, meaning wandering, uncertain, not held in place by anything so respectable as direction. A cloud could be vagus. A rumor could be vagus. A man who could not be persuaded to remain where society had thoughtfully placed him was, more often than not, vagus as well. From this name came vagari, to wander, not the disciplined wandering of soldiers or merchants, who always knew, in their hearts, where they were expected to arrive. No, this was the other kind, the inconvenient kind, the kind that follows curiosity instead of instruction, whether instead of schedule, and thought instead of permission. And then, as languages tend to do, when they grow ambitious, Latin produced vagabondus, a word that already sounds like it has been on the road too long to care about pronunciation. It meant one who wanders, not as an accident, but as a condition of being. The French took it in, as they often do with foreign words, and gave it a certain refinement, as though even wandering should be done with taste. From there it crossed the Channel, arriving in England, with a suitcase full of spellings and no intention of choosing just one. For a time, it tried on several identities, vagabond, and other hesitant forms, before finally settling in somewhat reluctantly into vagabond, as though even the word itself had grown tired of changing clothes. But words, like people, are rarely honest about themselves. They reveal more in how they are used than in how they are defined. A man with a horse, a purse, and a destination is called a traveler. A man with none of these things is often called a vagabond. The distance between the two is not measured in miles, but in approval. Kings traveled and were recorded. Pilgrims traveled and were blessed. Merchants traveled and were taxed. Sailors traveled and were lost, which somehow still counted as respectable. But the man without purpose that others could recognize, he traveled in a way that made people uneasy. And unease, as history repeatedly demonstrates, is often the beginning of accusation. So the word changed its posture. At first it merely described movement. Then it suggested aimlessness. Then it implied laziness. Then, with the quiet efficiency of legal language, it became somewhat close to guilt. Laws began to notice wandering in the way one notices a crack in a wall, less for what it is, and more for what it might become. To have no fixed abode was no longer simply unfortunate, it was suspicious. To have no visible means of support was no longer merely poverty, it was potential wrongdoing waiting for an opportunity. And so the vagabond was not always judged for what he had done, but for what he had failed to become. Yet words, like roads, do not only carry the intentions of those who build them, they also carry the footsteps of those who use them. Over time, the vagabond escaped the courtroom and wandered into literature. There, something curious happened. The same figure once treated as a problem to be managed became, in the hands of poets and storytellers, a kind of quiet revelation. Where law saw disorder, poetry saw freedom. Where officials saw absence of place, imagination saw presence of possibility. The vagabond became less a warning and more a question. What if a man without a home is not lost, but simply unclaimed? What if belonging everywhere is not the same as belonging well? What if the road is not a failure to settle, but a refusal to be reduced? Even language itself seems to agree with this restlessness. Its relative wander in every direction, vague drifts in meaning. A vagary is a thought that refuses to stay in line. The vagus nerve, deep within the body, travels where it pleases, indifferent to the idea that organs should behave like well-organized neighborhoods. Wandering, it seems, is not an exception, it is a pattern. Perhaps that is why the word has survived so long. Every age produces its share of people who insist that life must be anchored, and every age produces others who quietly suspect that anchors are overrated. And so the vagabond remains what he always has been, not merely a traveler, not merely a drifter, but a question that keeps walking. He asks, without ever stopping long enough to hear the answer, whether dignity requires a fixed address, whether freedom can be measured in property, and whether a life must be accounted for in order to be real. It is no surprise, then, that the word has never truly settled. After all, it was born for the journey.